So what we're going to do is we're going to go through, I have 11 addendums that we're going to try to make our way through. We'll just go through as many as we can in an hour. And if you guys have questions or stories about an amendment specifically, bring it up, because you guys learn best contextually when you hear like real agent stories. So don't be shy. The stories are the best part. I try to tell stories, but you guys also have stories you can tell. So what we're going to do, Jenny, I got the screen up here for you, is we are going to go through, these are the amendments. I'll read the list. And then if you guys have other ones that I don't mention, you specifically want to go to, we're going to go through third-party financing, the right to terminate due to lender's appraisal, the backup contract, the amendment, the hydrostatic testing, the mandatory membership in an HOA, sale of other property by buyer, seller's temporary residential lease, non-realty items, mineral reservation, and then the residential lease and the fixture lease. Is there any document that you guys wanted to cover that I did not say there? No? Okay, we're just going to do it then. We'll get through as much of that as we can. If you have questions, don't be shy. This is much more interesting if you guys share with each other. Okay, so the third-party financing addendum, first thing I want to point out is that they made changes to this form last fall that just became effective and required in February. So you need to make sure that in all your templates and the version that you're using is the one that says November 7th, 2022, because that's the new version. And basically, you know, you use this addendum when you are adding financing to the contract and want it to be contingent. You can actually also now use this form when you're adding financing to the contract and you don't want to do it to be contingent. And that's a big change and something that kind of happens where you have a buyer that for all intents and purposes is, you know, cash, like there's no appraisal contingency, there's no buyer qualification contingency, there's no property contingency, but you know, they're getting a loan from dad or they're getting like a private loan, and you don't want the listing agent to be surprised if an appraiser calls because there's like no contingencies happening. So we'll walk through it. So paragraph 1 talks about the types of financing that you're going to be getting. And typically, you know, we're checking the conventional financing box, and you got to check all ththese boxes, right? It just makes it more clean and complete. You really should check them. So, you know, it's how much of the amount are they financing? You know, is it a 15-year loan? Is it a 30-year loan? What's their expected interest rate, you know, for the first 15 or 30 years? And then, you know, how much origination charges. And you can talk to the buyer's lender to get all of these numbers. You don't have to make them up. If you are out showing houses and writing an offer and you're not in contact with the lender, it's good to know what the rates are right now, generally speaking. But I don't recommend that, because if you're out spending your time showing buyers properties, you should be talking to their lender, and they should have a lender, and they should be going through the approval process already. Otherwise, you guys are wasting your precious time. So any questions about that? Pretty straightforward. You know, if they're not sure if they're going to go conventional or FHA, like you can check both boxes and fill that in, you know, and section here, you're going to have to ask the lender. Generally it's 203B is the type of FHA loan. Sometimes if they're doing like an FHA loan where they're also going to do improvements, it's 203K. But again, that's something the lender should tell you. And then, you know, any other types of financing, but typically you're just filling out, you know, they're going conventional, so you fill this out, or you know, they're going FHA, so you just fill this out. This is the new paragraph where it says other type of financing. And this is if, like, you know, like I said, dad is financing it or a hard money lender is financing, just to like make the seller know. And then you can say buyer, you know, does waive all rights to terminate the contract under paragraph 2B. So basically, if you attach this, you're just saying there's no contingencies, and we are just there's no contingencies on the property qualifying, but we're notifying you that we're getting a loan. Does that make sense? So that's you're going to use this in the situation where the buyer is getting like a loan from dad or a hard money loan or something like that.
Is it required though for hard money?
I don't think it's required, but if you look at the contract now, I mean, what does required mean? If you look at the contract now, it does say like, you technically, yes, you should be saying, because if you put all cash, and it's not all cash, like that's kind of a misrepresentation. You can probably get away with it. You just have to be mindful of the fact that a lot of times when you say you're presenting as all cash, but then like they are getting a loan, the seller feels duped and the listing agent gets mad. So they've created this way through our paperwork now where you can say, hey, there's no contingencies here, but we are disclosing that we're getting this loan. Does that make sense?
Yes, questions are in, and I
yeah.
think it's fairly explicit what you just said. So if I check any of those others, and well, I can't do it for VA, but if I'm checking conventional and with competitive and we may need to waive the appraisal or whatever, I can't do that other. If I was going to have a conventional and waive the appraisal and all that stuff,
Yeah, that's a
I
great
still
question.
have to use that other addendum. I can't do G.
So say you're in multiple offers and you're like, this buyer has to get a loan, but there's no contingencies on the loan. Like worst case scenario, if they didn't qualify, like mom and dad would pay for it and there's no appraisal. So you would, fill this out, like we're getting conventional financing. And then you would go down here and you would say, it's not contingent on the buyer getting approval, right? We're waiving that contingency. And then you would add the appraisal waiver addendum that we're going to talk about next. And so then basically you're waiving the two main contingencies, which is the buyer qualifying under 2A and the property appraising under 2B. You do still have a contingency for like insurability or the HOA. So you're not totally waiving all the property contingencies in 2B, but that's basically the best way to do it. That's your strongest offer if you're getting conventional financing and you want to say we're waiving everything as much as possible. Does that make sense? If this is not clear, guys, we can spend as much time on it as possible because we have agents that have been in the business forever that still are confused about these contingencies. And so paragraph 1 is basically like saying this is the type of loan we're getting. Paragraph 2 is where the actual contingencies are put into place. And 2A, there's two separate contingencies in this document. 2A, which is the contingency on the buyer getting approved. And this is the one where you write in the timeline, right? Because you talk to the lender and you say, how long is it going to take you to get this buyer through, is that better? I can make this a little bit bigger. How long is it going to take to get this buyer through underwriting so that we can say they're good? And the lender will say, oh, it takes us 7 days if they're super fast, or 14 days or whatever. So you ask the lender how long they need. And you also have to give your buyer kind of the memo that they need to cooperate and get all of this information to their lender ASAP so that this amount of time can be as short as possible, right? If you've done all the homework for this buyer already, or you had a previous offer that didn't work out, you may be able to check this box that says buyer's approved. There's no contingency on them, right? Does that make sense? That's what the seller wants to see, right? That contingency doesn't exist here. So that's the buyer approval 2A, and that's the one where you write in the timeline. 2B is the property contingency. And this says, the buyer's lender determined that the property doesn't satisfy their underwriting requirements, which could mean appraised value, insurability, or repairs. Then the buyer has no later than 3 days before closing, they can terminate. And the way that they do that is they give the notice of termination, and the lender has to say what was wrong with the property that made it not qualify for their underwriting requirements, right? So in 2A, if you terminate in that timeline because the buyer doesn't qualify, because of RESPA, you don't have to say why. You can just say buyer didn't qualify. So that's kind of like an automatic out built for you into the contract for that many days, whatever you put in this blank, which is why sellers don't like to see it, right? Because you don't have to really give a reason why. You can just say they didn't qualify. And you don't even have to provide any proof of that. But here, and if you terminate under 2B, you are going to have to provide a note from the lender saying why the property did not qualify.
Okay, so I just want, because I had this one, and I'm sorry, if I'm dominating, I'll shut up here. But this is really helpful. On 2A, I had a situation where I was working on that, and somebody said no, that the lender has to provide. So what you're telling me is the buyer says I didn't qualify, whether they did or didn't, or they make it up. I'm being extreme here to make sure I understand, and they just make it up and say, Richard, we didn't. And let's say the lender isn't talking to me directly or whatever. I just send a termination based on this to the other selling agent.
Yeah, so here you can see the paragraph is clear. If buyer cannot obtain their approval, they can give written notice to seller and the contract terminates, period. This one says, you know, if buyer's lender determines that the property doesn't satisfy, buyer no later than 3 days before closing can terminate the contract by giving the written notice of termination and a copy of a written statement from the lender setting forth the reasons for the lender's determination. That language is not up here. It only is with respect to the property.
Okay. From a non-lawyer who's a little ambiguous, cannot obtain, I'm like, you know, so I mean, they could be lying or whatever. I'm being extreme, but there's no implicit requirement on me for them to submit something.
No, under, you're talking about with respect to buyer approval, no.
Yes, 2A.
Yeah, it's nobody's business why the buyer is financially not qualified, right? So if you
Thank
have a
you.
lender that you work with regularly, I mean,
Well, no.
yeah, okay. Does that
So
make sense, guys?
Zorine, question. B is property approval. It's inspection contingency, isn't it? I mean, appraisal contingency.
Appraisal contingency.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the next document we're going to talk about like waives the appraisal contingency. So we'll get there. Okay. Any questions? I know we're spending a lot of time on this document, but this one is like so important to what you guys are doing. So it's really, really important to understand it.
What if the selling agent has been in contact with the lender and everything was smooth, and then the buyer's agent says that they didn't approve?
Well, they didn't approve of the buyer, or they didn't approve of the.
Let's say the buyer says the lender wasn't going to give the loan, but the selling agent was talking to just checking in with the lender, and the lender said, "Oh, everything's smooth." Then what happens?
Well, I mean, I think this is why there's no written criteria, because realistically, like if the buyer went and bought a yacht, or applied to purchase a car, it may mess everything up. So like that, they may have been good yesterday and not good today because they went out and, bought another house, or does that make sense?
Yeah, but what if they could qualify? Let's say the buyer told their agent, "I didn't qualify," but
Yeah.
they actually did. And let's say the selling agent has been in communication with the lender, and the lender said,
I mean,
hold on, sorry, my phone.
no worries. I mean, arguably, like that's bad faith, and the seller could say, like, I'm not releasing the earnest money to you because you did qualify and your lender said you qualified, but because of RESPA, like we can't really ask for proof of that, right? And I mean, realistically, if the buyer wanted to be like, okay, well, I'm going to go and give away $500,000 today, then they wouldn't qualify anymore. So it is something that the buyer can control. So you kind of can't argue with it,
With the title company, Dawn, I thought, great question. This is stuff that's all in the gray, right? So in your experience, would title company honor to not release the earnest money?
This is a great question. In my experience, most title companies are only going to release the earnest money during the option period without signatures. It depends. You may get a title company that's like, this is clear and we're giving you the earnest money back. But, or like if property approval, if they terminate in writing and the lender gives notice and they send the reason why, you need to talk to your title company about, like, I know Republic Title will only ever release earnest money with all the signatures, right? On the release of earnest money. So it's a good question for your title company. It's actually something we should talk to Randy about because we haven't really faced that situation yet.
So what I'm hearing from you is if we kind of sense this is what's going on, we need to counsel our buyer that the seller could kind of claim bad faith and gum it up.
I mean, I don't want you guys to make people paranoid and like have your buyers.
No, it's only if it starts happening, what I'm saying?
Yes. I mean, the only way that your buyer is going to get their earnest money back without additional signatures is during the option, most likely. That's the most safe counsel, right?
Yeah.
But you should talk to your title company. Some may have a higher risk tolerance than others. So, okay, so, this is basically saying that if you're getting a note, there's going to be a lien recorded. This is for FHA, you have to put in this value here. And I just say, put in the purchase price. It's kind of a mystery what goes in that blank. So the purchase price is the right thing to put in there. And then this is additional information. This language changed a little bit that basically says that the buyer is giving, you know, people the authority to talk to Dawn's point, you know, give seller or buyer or their representatives information relating to the status of the approval, right? So if you wanted to, if you're the listing agent and you wanted to talk to the buyer's lender, here's where they are authorized to talk to you about it, right? So if they tell you that they're not, that's not correct. And then it's the same thing here with the lender, title company, escrow agent to give copies to brokers, et cetera. So this is just a little bit of CYA for like all the third parties involved. Good. Any questions here? Did this make anyone more confused or do we feel good about this form? Thumbs up. Jenny's looking at me. Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the next one. Give me a minute to pull it up. So the next document we're going to talk about is the right to terminate due to lender's appraisal. So let me share this guy. I feel like this document, I've talked about it a million times and you guys are probably tired of it, but it's still like a good conversation and a good document. Okay, so, you know, you put the property address in here. So this is a document where, you know, to Richard's point earlier, if you're trying to write a really good offer and say like, yes, we're getting financing, but we want the seller to have security that we're not going to terminate due to the appraisal. Like this is the form that you use. Please note, you can only use this document for conventional financing. FHA and VHA do not allow it, right? We have some language that we can write in there and FHA and VA deals. Angela and I have some language that we've saved. I don't know if it's really valid and enforceable, but at least it shows the intention of the parties, right? If you have a buyer that happens to be going FHA, but they, you know,
Zareen, what about the other financing?
the rest of them is fine. Just FHA and VA
Okay.
are the ones. Yeah.
Okay.
Because those are like consumer protections. Good question. Okay. So this document, you have 3 different ways that you can waive the, that you're waiving here. The first one is the one that the seller wants to see, which is like a total waiver of the appraisal. So if you're put a property under contract for $1 million and it appraises for 700, your buyer is bringing 300 additional to closing to make up the gap if they check this box. It's a full waiver so it doesn't matter what it appraises for. So this one's risky. And before you put anything into any of these blanks, you need to be talking to your buyer's lender because the buyer may be like, oh yeah, I have tons of cash. Like, let's just waive this. But if they do waive this, they could be messing up their like debt to income, and the lender will be able to give you insight into whether the buyer can in fact waive this if they're in the position to do that fully, right? Does that make sense? So that's the one that the seller wants to see, but it's the most risky for the buyer. And you have to make sure that your buyer could actually write that check if it like way under appraises. This second one is a partial waiver where, say in that situation, the buyer's like, okay, you know, it's listed at 950. We're going to go to $1 million because we really want it. But we want it to at least appraise for 950. So we're going to put 950 here. You know, if it appraises only for 980, like we'll make up the difference. So that's when you put in a number here. Or your buyer may say, you know, we're going 200 over ask. We're fine as long as it appraises for, you know, 1-1. And you just put in what value that is there. But you need to talk to the lender before we're just like making up numbers based on what the buyer says. Like the lender will have a better idea of how much cash does this buyer really have to make up the difference if they have to, and what's a number that is appropriate to put in that blank. Does that make sense?
Can you explain 2-1?
2-1. Yes. So it basically says the buyer waives the buyer's right to terminate under 2B, which we just looked at in the financing addendum, if the property approval is not obtained because the opinion of value and the appraisal does not satisfy the lender's underwriting requirements. So, you know, in my example of $1 million, let's say they're putting 200 down and they're financing 800, right? So your the loan to value is 80%. And if it only appraises for 900, the lender is only going to loan 80% of 900, which means the buyer has to make up the difference, right? Does that make sense? So basically what's that saying is that the lender's not going to give their underwriting approval because the property didn't appraise for the value that we wanted it to appraise for. Does that make sense? Because most lenders, you know, if it's $1 million deal and they're financing 800, they're going to want to see it appraised for $1 million or more to make sure that they're well secured in what they're lending on.
And to be clear, in your example, then you would, if it was acceptable to the buyer, they would write 900,000
Right.
in 2II, right?
Yeah. So they would put, if they were like, okay, well, and we know the lender wants it to appraise for $1 million to feel secure, but if it only appraises for 900 and they're going to only finance 80% of 900, we are comfortable bringing the difference so that, you know, the lender is well secured at an 80% loan to value. And we've put additional cash down now to get to our $1 million purchase price. Does that make sense? I can't see faces, so it's hard to see if we see
Yes.
good faces or confused faces.
This document's very hard. Everyone can realize that. It's
Yeah.
almost inappropriate in my opinion.
Well, this is why, like, if you
And we
you
haven't even
call
got
me-
to 3.
Yeah, you can call me every weekend when you're writing offers and we can walk through it together and also make sure that your lender is involved and understands what you're putting in here as well. And if you ever need me to get on the phone with the lender to like walk them through it, most lenders you're working with should be familiar, but happy to do it because it is very confusing. That's exactly right.
Yeah, this one scares me. So please spend time on it.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, that's, you know, total waiver, it's what the seller wants. It's super risky. Partial waiver, you need to make sure that the buyer's lender is comfortable with whatever number you're putting in there and that the buyer understands they're making up the difference. Are we okay? Okay. Got some nods. Okay. So then this last one, this is a totally different scenario. And you're only going to use this one in the circumstances where your buyer is like putting down so much that the lender's loan to value, they're not going to be bothered. So in my example, say it's $1 million property and the buyer is putting down $500,000 of cash and they're only financing 500,000, right? So the lender, and they're doing what the loan to value there is, it has to be, it's 50%, whatever. The lender doesn't, if the property only appraises for 900, the lender's not going to care because they're only lending $500,000 on a $900,000 property is very comfortable for the lender. Does that make sense? Their loan to value is fine there. They don't care that it didn't appraise for the $1 million purchase price, right? They're like, if it appraised, as long as it appraised for, I can't do the math that quickly in my head, as long as it appraised for 600, they would be fine. But the buyer may be like, well, if I'm putting $500,000 of my cash into it, I at least want it to appraise for 850, 900, 950, whatever the number is to make the buyer feel confident that they're putting their cash in the right place. So you use paragraph 3 in the circumstance where the buyer's lender is fine and doesn't care what it appraises for because they're so well secured, but the buyer would care. So you're kind of you're giving a new right to the buyer to terminate as long as it appraises for this much. Are we good with that? Does that make sense?
Why would you check that? I mean, I understand what you just said, but why would you? I think David was right.
Yeah. So here's the deal. So say you're working with a buyer and they're looking at $2 million properties and they're like, we, have this gift of, $1.5 million that my parents are paying, but I'm still going to get a loan for 500,000 so that I have a mortgage. Right. So in that case, if the property appraised for $1 million and they're paying $2 million, like the lender doesn't care because they're only loaning $500,000 on what they think is $1 million property. And the lender's fine with that. But the buyer may be like, whoa, we're paying $2 million for a property that only appraised for $1 million. So we at least want the property to appraise for 1.5 million. So the lender's not going to care if it doesn't appraise in this situation. The buyer's going to care. So you only check this box in the circumstance where your buyer is putting down so much cash that the lender doesn't care about the appraisal, but the buyer still cares about the appraisal. Does that example help a little bit?
Yes. What if the buyer, in a traditional sense, particularly in this market right now, what if the buyer says, I don't want to purchase this property if it doesn't appraise at 1.5?
Then you put that's exactly what you do here.
But it's not a lender situation. It's that in that particular case, it's the buyer says,
They're
hey,
just paying cash.
no, they're saying I'm financing, but I don't want, like, if they don't want to deal with multiples and they just want to make a clean offer and they say, hey, if your property doesn't appraise above, what it's listed at, we're not moving forward. When this
Then you would put this. Are you saying that they're getting financing or they're getting cash?
No,
Or-
they're getting financing.
Okay, so then you would put, then you don't need this. You're not waiving the appraisal.
Okay.
Then we go back to,
Just checking.
yeah, then we go back to this, which basically says if the property doesn't meet the lender's underwriting requirements for appraisal, then the buyer has the right to terminate. And that's just straightforward. So that in that case, it would have to appraise for the full purchase price. So you only need this appraisal waiver if you want to be a little bit cute about what it really has to appraise for. If you're acknowledging that it's probably not going to appraise for value and we're okay with that. Does that make sense? Okay. Hopefully this is helping and not making it more confusing. I feel like I'm making this more confusing, but at the minimum, you guys know you can call me and we can talk through your specific situation and go from there.
This is very helpful.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to go through the backup contract. So, and this I think might be a popular document again now because there's so little inventory, and I think backup contracts are a good way to go. Especially if you were like the second choice, it doesn't cost anything other than the option fee to be in second position, and you can continue to look. So we'll talk through it. Okay, so you put the address of the property and then you say, the contract to which this addendum is attached, which is binding, right? It's a binding contract. Everything must be paid, but it's contingent upon the termination of the first contract. And here in this blank, you put the effective date of the primary contract, right? The one that you lost out to. And so, except as provided here, neither party is required to perform while it's contingent. So you're saying like they're in first place, that contract that's dated, affected, whatever date, but we're in second place. And then it says, if the first contract does not terminate on or before this date, and there's different choices of what you can put in this blank. You can put the option, you can put the closing date, right, of the first contract. And then you're just sitting there in backup position until that contract either terminates during option or closes. I just would put the closing date because if you're going to tie it up, you might as well just keep it tied up for as long as you can, right? So on or before, I would put the closing date. The backup contract terminates in earnest. So if it goes ahead, if you get in backup and it does not terminate on the closing date and it closes, then this contract will terminate automatically and your earnest money gets refunded. If the first contract does terminate, then the seller must notify the buyer immediately. And the day that the seller gives notice to the backup buyer that the first contract terminated becomes the new actual effective date for the contract. And that's the date that all of your dates start counting from, your option and your financing and your delivery of other documents. Does that make sense? So you
Yes.
basically, it's like you have, go ahead, Kathy.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
No.
when they amend that effective date, they need to use that form.
Okay, just to notify you want to make sure that everyone's on the same page, that
There's a
this was-
specific form to notify of the new effective date
yes,
when your backup contract becomes primary.
it's a Trek form.
Correct.
Next time I'll show that form.
Yeah.
But yes, you just want to make sure everyone's on the same page about what the effective date is.
Correct.
And then this is saying, if they amend or modify the first contract, or they change the closing date, or they negotiate repairs, that's not a termination. And then what this means is that if you haven't, this paragraph D, if you have the option in your backup contract, then basically, as soon as you sign the backup, you're in option. So if you find a better house and you go under contract, you can terminate this one. Whether you've been notified that the first contract terminated or not. Does that make sense? So basically you're in your option until you get notice of you're now the primary contract because the first one terminated. And then you still have your same number of option days from the date of that notice. So you have just like, if you find something better, you can terminate basically.
So what do you need to give to the seller if you're in backup to terminate?
Technically you just give them a notice of termination.
Okay.
But when you go under contract as the backup, you should deliver the earnest money and the option fee. Because in the contract, remember, if you don't deliver the earnest money in a timely fashion, the seller has the right to terminate the contract.
Say that
So-
one more time, Zareen, relative to timing. I thought I heard you say you need to do it when you submit the option.
So when you execute a backup contract, there's a lot of agents that are like, oh, we're not going to send in our earnest money until we become the primary contract. I do not recommend doing it that way, because if you remember in the 1 to 4, if the buyer doesn't submit their earnest money within the 3-day period, then the seller has the right to terminate. And that would apply to a backup contract as well. So you do want to submit your earnest and your option money in a backup situation within the 3 days, just like it's a normal contract.
Even though you would have that 3 days from the new effect. So I understand your point, I think. I'm just clarifying.
I wouldn't risk it.
But technically though, just so I make sure I understand, the new effective date moved out to the right. They communicated it. So technically I got 3 days from that new effective date, correct?
Technically, yes.
Okay, but you don't recommend it just
I
because.
don't recommend that, because this says, you'll see this is a capital A, amended effective date. It doesn't just say it replaces the effective date. So I still think you're bound to deliver, because what if you don't deliver any option? You have to deliver the option money, because that's what's tying up the property, right? And that's not money you're giving back. So it doesn't make sense that you would have to deliver the option money within the 3 days, the first 3 days, but not the earnest money, in my opinion. And arguably the seller, if you have an effective date of this contract, right? Even though it's a backup, you have an effective date and you have 3 days from that to deliver the earnest money. Arguably the seller could say, well, you didn't deliver your earnest money within those 3 days, so I'm terminating because they get a better backup or whatever. Does that make sense? I would deposit both. Definitely do the option money. I think you should do the earnest money as well.
Zareen, what's the lowest amount you can put and then do additional if you are the primary?
So that's a great
I
question.
can't
So a lot
remember
of
how I did
agents-
it, but I did
No.
tiny numbers and I did additional, but I can't remember if I did additional earnest and option. So it was tiny numbers. So even if it took a while to get it back from title, it didn't matter.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great question. And you might do in your contract $1,000 of earnest money. I think the option, I mean, you are preserving your place as the first backup. So I don't know if and legally they say you need a peppercorn or like a nominal amount of consideration. So I would make it at least $10, but I would at least probably make it at least 100.
Can you make it additional option and earnest, or can you just do additional earnest?
I would just do additional earnest. I think you're making it a little bit complicated to do additional option. But if the
Is
seller
it
wants
correct that you don't get the option back if you never get,
your option money back ever,
even
ever,
if you're, okay.
So that's why I think like 100 is like enough, but it's not like an exorbitant amount. Like your buyer has to understand that they're paying and they're going to lose $100 to be first in line.
So,
Right.
so what you're really coaching us is assuming, you almost have to assume that there's going to be more than one backup and you're trying to position yourself first.
You backup offers?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you have to, as on the listing side, you have to be super mindful when you're negotiating backups that it's quite possible that your first one will fall out and your seller is stuck with these terms. So make sure you actually negotiate it and you care, and that you're not just saying, well, let's put it in backup so that we have leverage, because that has happened before where they did a backup to make sure that the first one stuck and then it didn't. And the seller was unhappy with the terms of the backup because they didn't really negotiate it as hard as they would have if they knew it was going to become the first one, or they got another offer when they had a backup in place. And the second offer, I guess the third offer, was even better than the backup, but the backup's in first spot. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, it's contrarian, but couldn't you at some percentage of the time give good advice to your client to say, don't accept the backup? And you could even have almost as a blanket cause. I mean, other than special reasons, could you make an argument that it's a negative for the seller? I've always kind of felt like that.
I mean, you could. I think fear of loss is a great motivator. And I think it's really nice when you're negotiating as a seller to, if the buyer gives you like an absurd list of repairs, your first primary contract in the option, you can be like, we have a backup, like, we're not gonna do this, like, we'll do this and this. Cause they don't know if your backup is amazing or if your backup is terrible, right? I mean,
Well,
there are
and
sellers.
and it's nice to get a backup that's even like $1,000 more. You could say, look, the backup's higher than yours.
Yeah, and I mean, that's where it helps to like, the question is like sharing information and being ethical and honest. I think once you're under contract, you can say, I mean, I've been in this situation before with an agent where the backup was like $200,000 more and they were buying all the furniture. So it was like a $450,000 better deal for us to get the backup. But the first contract, like they were totally non-negotiable with the first contract, but the first contract really wanted the house and the seller was really trying to do everything to make it like unattractive for the first buyer to buy it. And ultimately the first buyer closed and the seller and the second buyer were both super bummed, but that's just how it goes. So yes, I mean, that it helps for you to like have that leverage of, well, we have another contract, right?
Okay.
Some sellers don't have you have to do what your sellers want, right? Some sellers don't have the stomach for like negotiating really hard and some do. So you just have to explain their options and then let them make the decision. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a follow-up question around a point Dawn made? She appears to have way more experience than I do. So, I heard you sort of coaching us use a lower amount for the earnest money. And then I think Don was implying that if the backup offer goes, then we up the earnest money.
You don't have to do that. I mean, if you're working with a first-time home buyer and they only have $10,000 of cash that they're going to use as their earnest money, you don't want to put, $8,000, so.
I get that though, but I think she was making sort of a negotiation point, going low, and then the seller could be rest assured that if it goes into option, they're going to get some more earnest money.
Yes.
From a strategy
Yeah,
standpoint.
you can say, look, we don't want to tie up all of our cash. So we'll put additional earnest money in, upon notice of termination of the first contract, and we can help you draft that. Or you can just put, it's a little bit tricky to count the days because the 1 to 4 does have a form where a blank where you could contemplate adding additional earnest money, but figuring out the timing is tricky. So if you need help, Angela and I could write some language that says like, within 3 days after the amended effective date, the buyer will deposit an additional X as earnest money. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Helpful.
No problem. Okay. So then, for purposes of this addendum, time is of the essence. So there's not a lot of provisions in our contracts where time is of the essence, but that just means strict compliance with deadlines. Like there's no wiggle room. Like even in our 1 to 4, the closing date is not an of the essence provision. And that's like a legal term of art, which means if you don't close on the closing day, it doesn't mean that you're automatically in default the next day. Arguably you're in default, but it's not automatic because time is not of the essence. Okay. All right, moving on. We are going to talk about the amendment now, which might seem kind of dumb, but I think is like important to be strategic as an agent when you're filling out this amendment. Okay. So here's the amendment, and seller and buyer amend the this is usually used during the option, right? And my recommendation is please do not wait till the day that the option expires to start negotiating. Like as soon as you have your information, like get the negotiations going. You're just a better agent if you do that way and you're not operating under a deadline and you have no idea where the seller is on the day. They might be in surgery all day. You have no idea if the listing agent is getting on a plane. Just give yourself the luxury of time of submitting this amendment as quickly as you can before the option expires so that you're not like negotiating under a deadline. That's me being like having had many panicked phone calls at like 4:30 p.m. when people are trying to get these things done. Okay, so here is if your buyer if you're changing the sales price, right? Then you have to change all of these numbers. And also if you are adding financing in, they're going to ask you to do an amendment to add the financing in there, which is fine. And then this says, in addition to repairs and treatments otherwise required by the contract, seller shall complete the following repairs. And then in the new contract, paragraph 7 requires, this is not something that used to be required, but paragraph 7 requires that the seller provide the buyer the copy of the copies of the notice of completion of all of the repairs, which is awesome. This is something that you guys as really good agents are obviously already doing as listing agents and requesting as buyer's agents. But now the contract requires that the sellers submit proof of everything that was done. And that's helpful to the buyer because they know who did the work and what exactly got done and, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a good change in the contract of the new form that was changed in November and now is effective this February that you guys should all be using. You can see this one's new too. But these are just minor changes. So this is where you put any repairs. And I always say with repairs, I think the best way to do it is to technically reference the section of the inspection that you're wanting them to repair, so that we don't just say like, fix the drain if like the inspector calls out maybe something a little bit more complicated. I think that's the most effective way to do it, and then send them the inspection so that they can reference it. And if they don't want the inspection, which I think is BS, then at least send them screenshots of this section of the inspection that you're requesting to be repaired, because then you're giving them the information that they need. Does that make sense?
Yes. Zareen, what language can you use in number 2 that says see attached, that would list out all of the items?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like plumbing repairs referenced in section 5A 7B of the inspection report. See attached, or or you could put together a little like Word document where you like copied everything. Or if you're going to send them the whole inspection, I would just reference the sections of the inspection. Plumbing repairs in sections, whatever on page 12.
Which is like the actual repairs or the actual section should be listed there rather than simply saying see attached document.
I mean, yes, because you need to say specifically the attached document is probably 30 plus pages. So you need to say, plumbing repairs referenced here, HVAC repairs here.
Sorry, or see a list of requests of repairs.
Yes.
I do Zareen, this is JB. I do I call it like an attachment. I'm happy to send it. Like I call it an attachment or something. And then in my attachment, it's like has our logo on the top, my name at the bottom, and whatever I called it, I use those exact words in number 2, but then I say per page 1, paragraph 2A, repair roof. And then I ask in a list. It's like almost like an executive summary, a 1-page recap of what we're asking for in repairs. And then I reference the inspection report pages, because if the agent doesn't want the full report, I do have to copy, paste, cut out, whatever. But there's a recap instead of making them dig through and going to that page and then putting the ask on that random inspection page. I do a 1-page recap.
Yes, and I think that's the cleanest way to do it. However you guys want to set it up is to reference specifically the inspection. That to me is the cleanest way. And then there's no confusion where it's like, well, you said fix the window, so I patched it. And it's like, no, we wanted you to like replace it, or because it's foggy or whatever. It's just, you're just being more clear.
Hey, JB, why did you say in case the agent doesn't want the full report? I mean, they don't really have the option to do that, do they?
Yes. So that's a great question. So a lot of times agents will be like, please don't send me the inspection report. And that's really annoying because they're hindering your ability to like communicate about the property and what needs to be done. Obviously, they just don't want to be on notice of everything in there. And as soon as the listing agent, it comes into your inbox, then you're on notice and the seller is technically on notice as well. And you have to deliver it to the seller, right? So a lot of agents are like, please don't send it to me, which I understand. But I also, as an attorney, if someone sends me the inspection report and like, it's just it's just more information, and it's an opportunity for your seller to call out all the vendors and get these things fixed, or send it to punch list and be like, okay, punch list, what's the cost for you to fix all of these things? I think it's bogus when listing agents are like, please don't send me the report, because it's just making more work for you in this process, because you have to like cut and paste the relevant sections. That's just me. I understand why they don't, but
if there's a backup offer and if you want to play nice, I do whatever the listing agent says. If I want to play nasty because they're being a jerk, then I send the whole report. But if they truly say, please don't send me the full report, I'm gonna honor that if I want to get the deal done and get what my
Yes.
want done.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you, JB. That's the learning I was looking for. Appreciate it.
Yeah, perfect.
Serene, if I'm
thank you.
selling a house and somebody only sends me a couple little screenshots or pieces of it,
Mhm.
and they end up terminating, since I have that, but it's not the full report, what am I responsible for conveying? Could I just have the seller add that to the seller's disclosure and be done with it? Or do I need to disclose that there was a report?
No, I don't, I mean, well, first of all, it's the seller's duty to disclose, right? So we're facilitating what they're disclosing. But it's not our place to disclose, although obviously if there's things we know they should be disclosing that they're not disclosing, we can't work with them anymore. But yes, I think you could just add that to the existing seller's disclosure. There's actually, I think Texas Association of Realtors has a form that's like amendment to the seller's disclosure. And it's very straightforward. It doesn't have to be on a form. But you might also have your seller like have their plumber look into those items. You can say like, well, we had this, but here's the repair for this, right? But yes, if you become aware of something that's not working, you need to disclose it.
Well,
So-
on the
so-
seller's disclosure, it references any recent inspections, but if we don't
I
have the
would
full
share that
report,
stuff.
we don't need to reference that one.
Right. I mean, you share what you know. You didn't get the
Okay.
full inspection report. So,
So follow-up question. So to JB's point, I just recently had a more adversarial interaction. And so I looked up the Trek stuff because I kind of wanted to understand what I was technically supposed to do and could they ignore it and so forth. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but the way I interpreted the Trek stuff, the language, was once that agent gets it, to your point, once it's in their inbox, they got it and they have
Yes.
to communicate it to the seller. But it sounded, my memory was that the wording was that even though if the agent has it, that the agent has to disclose.
well, I mean, we can't do anything that's not in the best interest of our sellers, right? Or against our sellers' wishes. But if we know that the seller is not doing something that they're bound to do, we have to have a hard conversation with them to say like, well, I'm aware of this. You can't represent them anymore if they're trying to like conceal something that you know is a defect in the property.
So
Yeah,
if
you're correct. You're correct in that they do have to disclose that. If the seller doesn't, even though it is against their interest, the realtor code of conduct, you do have to disclose that as a realtor.
Well, that's what I thought. That was my read of it. And so, Zareen, you're more experienced than me, but when I was reading our code of conduct and everything, if I've got a bad inspection report and a buyer agent asks me, I gotta tell them I've got one. But
Yeah, yes, but yes, you can't not disclose it, but your seller is also required to disclose it, right? Yes.
so am I bound by our code of conduct in Trek to, if they ask me for it and I had it?
Well,
to
what
send it to 'em?
I would talk to the seller, and if the seller is like, do not disclose that, I would sever the relationship. That's what we coach here, because obviously you can't be working with the seller who you know is actively not fulfilling their obligations, because they're putting you in a terrible spot. So, I mean, I guess you could disclose it and continue to try to work with the seller, but to me, that seems very risky. I would explain to the seller what their obligations are, and if they refuse to fulfill them, then I would excuse myself from the representation. Because I mean, that's exactly the kind of situation that's going to get you in a lawsuit. Whether it's a lawsuit from the buyer because you didn't disclose something you were supposed to, or a lawsuit from the seller because you disclosed something that they were supposed to that they didn't. Does that make sense? That's a practical answer.
Thank you.
Does that help?
It does. It's a little gray area. And
It is a little gray. It's
and
tricky.
our
I mean,
colleagues across the industry are not always fun to work with, as JB point.
yes. And I mean, that's why our code of conduct is so extensive, because we have multiple duties that sometimes conflict. So then you have to figure out like, what's going to keep me out of the lawsuit, right? Not what necessarily is going to get me to the closing table, sadly. That's my opinion. So, okay, this is, the closing date. 12A1B is the seller repairs. So if you get your inspection, you upload it to punch list, they say all the things you were going to ask for are about $3,000 of repairs or 4,000, you can just, instead of asking the seller to perform those repairs and give you receipts, you can say, I just want $3,000 and I'm going to have them done by punch list after the closing myself or by my vendor who I choose. One thing you have to be mindful in this blank is that you need to talk to the buyer's lender, because every buyer only has such a certain amount of closing costs that can be paid. So you don't want to negotiate for $20,000 and then the buyer only has $16,000 available to be paid under this provision. So you need to talk to the buyer's lender before you put a number in this blank. Generally, it's like, in a conventional, I think it's 3%. Don't quote me on that. That's why you need to talk to the lender. Does that make sense? Okay. The cost of lender will, this is if they decide to split it, if there's lender required repairs, which neither party has to. This is if you want to extend the option, which if you are going to extend the option, you must pay this money. I can't stress that over and over enough. It can be $5 to extend the option, but you have to pay it, right? You can't just not. So you can take $5 to the house and put it on the thing and take a picture. You can have the buyer Venmo, you can whatever. You just need to make sure that there is some way that consideration is paid legally in order for your buyer to actually have that additional option time. Here, make sure on the listing side that this box is checked. This was actually vindicating for me. I had a client once who listed with a different agent but of course was like consulting me through the whole process, which was very annoying. And they negotiated repairs early, and the listing agent did not check this box. So the buyer came back before the option was expired and asked for more repairs. And they still had the right to terminate because this box wasn't checked. So make sure on the listing side, if you're agreeing to do whatever, that you also check this, because it's like, okay, we're agreeing to give you these things and now the option is over, right? That's a silly one, but it's really important. Do not forget to check that. This is if you need to extend the amount of time in 2A that the buyer has to get qualified. No seller is going to like to see that, but sometimes it happens. So any questions about this form? I'm looking in the chat. Margaret says, what if it's a remodel? I don't understand the question. Margaret, if you want to unmute and elaborate, go for it. That may be an old question too. Okay, it's 10:53. We're going to just.
If it's a remodel, then a lender's going to see that and he's going to say, obviously repairs are going to be a whole lot more. And I had this happen one time and the guy got out of it, but he said, well, the value is with, so much less. If you have to do repairs, it will be, say 20% of the value, not 5.
So you're talking about the amount in 12A1B?
I guess it is. I don't remember.
Yeah. So then what you should do is, then you need to ask especially if it's a remodel, it's like, okay, well, you're a remodeler, like fix all of these things and make an actual list like JB's talking about. Like, these are all of the items we want you to fix. And then we also want this much cash so that we can fix X, Y, and Z ourselves.
But what I'm saying is the lender won't approve if there is over 5%, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay.
Even though they're willing to do it.
Well, it's not that the lender won't approve it, it's that the buyer has the right to terminate. So she's talking about a provision in the contract. If there's lender required repairs, this is in the 1 to 4, and the cost of the repairs exceeds 5% of the value of the contract, then even if the seller is willing to do those repairs, the buyer has the right to walk away because they're like, wow, this house needs a lot more, is in worse condition than I thought. And I don't want a house where, the value of the things that need to be repaired exceed 5% of the cost. So,
but if this is the thing that happened to me, and this has been years ago, the buyer was in a bind and he didn't want to buy it at the end. And he said, well, the lender said, because the repairs are at least 5% more than what it is, the value of the house is, then we're not going to go forward.
yes, that is correct. That is the buyer's option. If the cost of lender required repairs exceeds 5% of the value of the contract, the buyer has the right to terminate.
Okay.
They can't, you can't force a buyer to buy a house that needs like all these repairs.
Okay.
And the way that they figure that out is 5%.
These questions have been wonderful.
Good,
They're
yeah,
pretty, and they're exactly what I'd be asking.
perfect. Well, good. That, yeah, you guys learn best from each other. So, okay, I'm skipping ahead and we're gonna do in our last 4 minutes. First sidebar, if you're here for CE credit, I have some of you, but a lot of you joined a little bit late. Please put your name and license number into the chat and you can Venmo CG Partners $10 to pay. And when you pay, please also put your license number in the like payment memo. Cause that's how I use like checks and balances of this person put their name in the chat and they paid me. And so we're good to go. And I'm also keeping a list here that I'll go over it in 4 minutes when we're done here. I'm gonna do this document in 4 minutes. Wish me luck. Okay. So, this is the HOA document and this one's really important and we're skipping ahead because, I want you guys to understand that. So basically the buyer has the right, if the property you're selling is in a mandatory HOA, the buyer has the right to terminate within 3 days after receiving the HOA information, period, for no reason. So that's a very open-ended right to terminate if they haven't received the HOA documents. So on the listing side, even though it might cost you a little bit of money up front to order the HOA information and the resale certificate, and you may have to pay to have it updated if you don't go under contract in a certain amount of time. I think if you're trying to remove all contingencies, it's very wise to order the subdivision information in advance. So these are the options. And then you can deliver it like, just like we do the seller's disclosure upfront and we eliminate the buyer's opportunity to terminate after receiving the seller's disclosures. Like I recommend you deliver the HOA documents upfront because then that removes the buyer's ability to terminate within 3 days of receiving the HOA. So, so in this one, this is if, within, usually put at least 10 days, because that's how long it takes most homeowners association management companies to deliver it. Within 10 days after the effective date, seller shall obtain, pay for, and deliver the subdivision information. Now, if you do it this way, where you don't order it till you go under contract, then if seller delivers the information, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after they receive the information or prior to closing, whichever occurs first. So that's an out for your buyer. So just be aware of that. If they never receive it, they can terminate and get their earnest money back. So that's the first one to be aware of. The second one is same thing. And this is another way where if you want to be sneaky, you can put a really long amount of time in here. And the buyer has this open-ended right to terminate until they get the HOA information, right? But the buyer's still gonna have to obtain and pay for it under this, right? Okay, so then this next one is if you have ordered it in advance, buyer has received and approved the subdivision information. And with the subdivision information, which are like the recorded documents, you're also gonna get a resale certificate that the HOA management company has to prepare that says like, is there any outstanding lawsuits? Like, what is the amount of reserves? Are there any upcoming assessments? Like current information on this certificate. And if you just ordered it 2 weeks ago and you deliver it now, it's probably still current, but some lenders may require an updated one if you ordered it like 2 months ago. I don't remember, and I don't want to say it's always 60 days or it's always 90 days because I don't know, and it might be different for different lenders and for different HOAs. So you may want to say they do require an updated resale certificate. And then, if they do require it, seller at buyer's expense will deliver it to buyer within 10 days after receiving payment. But buyer may terminate this contract and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer if they fail to deliver the updated resale certificate. So they don't have an open-ended right to terminate here, only if you don't deliver it. So this, I think, is the most safe option on the listing side. Order it when you get the listing, pay for the resale certificate. The buyer's going to have to pay for an updated resale certificate if they require one. So that protects your seller, in my opinion. The other thing that's important about ordering it up front when you get the listing, just like you do the seller's disclosure with the listing paperwork before you go under contract, is down here. And we'll talk about that. So here, then buyer does not require delivery of the subdivision information. That's really weird. So I would never check that box. Okay. So then this happens if you're under contract in an HOA and like a lawsuit comes up during the course of the contract, or there's a huge flood or something. This is when, seller has to give notice to buyer of material changes. And this is provisions under which the buyer can terminate. if there's a material change during the course of the contract. Okay, so now this one is important. Buyer shall pay any and all association fees, deposits, reserves, and other charges associated with the transfer not to exceed X amount. So this is also where on the listing side, you need to educate yourself and your seller about what your HOA charges to transfer, because most of them are not that much, but there are ones where it's $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000. And on the listing side, you don't want to say, accept a contract where the buyer's agent just put in like $200 and then it's a $3,000 cost and your seller's holding the bag for $2,800. So you need to know what the transfer fees are when you list. So that's a question to ask the HOA management company or to look for in the HOA documents so that you don't get caught, having your seller have to pay a large fee. You can negotiate this, right? If you know it's $2,000, you can say, well, we want you to split it with us. So you need to pay $1,000 and we'll pay the other. Does that make sense? Okay. So
Adrian, I forgot where you put some of the like Del Webb's, you have to pay $1,500 or $1,800 in addition to HOA. I
Mhm.
can't remember where that goes.
It's here. It's the transfer fee.
So that's included, the HOA from the
Should-
title. So it's because it's really termed as not an initiation fee, but that would be included in that.
I would confirm with the title company and with the HOA, but yes, this is really the only place that this would be contemplated in our paperwork. So it should go here. Any and all association fees, deposit reserves, and other charges associated with the transfer. Right?
Including an unpaid assessment or something like that.
No, I mean, assessments are going to be different. You're going to have to address that. This paragraph does not apply to fees, assessments, or dues that are prorated and costs and fees. So if there's an unpaid assessment, like that's going to come out of the seller's pocket at closing, unless you negotiate for it. So yes, when you get a listing with in an HOA, it's annoying, but there's a lot of homework you have to do up front to make sure that your seller is protected. Okay. Oh, sorry, guys. It's 11:03. I'm so sorry. I just was having so much fun. I didn't pay attention to the time. Okay. So I have, let's see, Karen, Lulu.